What happens to a home when the word welcome quietly expires without anyone announcing its funeral? When one day you're family and the next you're simply tolerated, measured, and managed like furniture that's overstayed its usefulness. Because that was the question circling my mind long before the night everything changed. Long before fear put shoes on my feet and a bag in my hand. Because it didn't begin with cruelty the way people imagine cruelty begins. Loud and unmistakable, it began softly, politely, with smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes and pauses that lasted a second too long. And I didn't notice at first because mothers and grandmothers are trained to excuse discomfort as gratitude, to swallow small humiliations and call it adjustment, to confuse endurance with love. And that's how I found myself telling friends I was settling in nicely, while carefully shrinking myself to fit a house that used to feel warm and now felt carefully organized against me, where every object had a place except me. And if you're wondering how a grandmother ends up feeling like an inconvenience in her own child's home, the answer is simpler than you think. It happens when you try too hard not to be one. When you tiptoe around your own needs because you don't want to be labeled difficult. When you laugh at jokes made at your expense because silence feels heavier than embarrassment. And when you convince yourself that being quiet is the same as being kind. And at first it was small things I brushed off. Like the way my cup was moved from the table without asking, or how conversations paused when I entered the room, and then resumed in a slightly different tone, like a door quietly closing behind me. And I told myself it was all in my head, that I was sensitive, that aging comes with unnecessary suspicion, because that's what we're taught to believe about ourselves once our hair turns gray. That our instincts have expired along with our usefulness. And I wish I could say there was one clear moment when I should have known, one undeniable sign I ignored, but the truth is worse, it was 1,000 moments. Each too small to protest on its own. Yet together they formed a pattern that only makes sense in hindsight. Like the way meals became scheduled around my absence, or how decisions about the house were made without my knowledge even when they directly affected me. And I told myself I was lucky to have a roof, lucky to have family. Lucky not to be alone, because loneliness is the threat we're always warned about, as if it's worse than being invisible, and I began to feel that strange, aching contradiction of being surrounded by people who no longer saw me, of speaking and watching words fall harmlessly to the floor, unheard and uncollected. And if you've ever felt like your presence required permission, you know how exhausting it is to constantly ask for it without words. And somewhere along the way, I stopped calling the room I slept in my room and started calling it the spare. As if labeling it temporary would make the feeling easier to bear. And maybe you're wondering why I didn't leave sooner. Why I didn't confront anyone. Why I didn't stand up for myself the moment I felt disrespected. And I ask myself that too, but the answer is tangled in years of motherhood, in the belief that sacrifice equals love, in the fear that speaking up would fracture what little peace remained, and in the quiet hope that things would improve if I just tried harder to be agreeable, to be helpful, to be invisible. Because invisibility feels safe when you sense hostility growing. And yet it was that very invisibility that emboldened them. Because when people stop acknowledging your presence, they begin to speak as if you're not there. And the house slowly filled with a tension I couldn't name but could feel, like a storm held back by politeness. And I remember that particular evening clearly, not because anything dramatic happened at first, but because it felt unusually calm, almost staged, as if the air itself was holding its breath. My son had gone to bed early, his wife moved through the house with efficient quiet. And I sat alone listening to the clock tick louder than usual, wondering when ticking became such a powerful reminder of time running out. Not of life, but of belonging, and I told myself I was overthinking again. That I should be grateful that tomorrow would be better, because that's what hope looks like when it's tired. And I decided to turn in early, carrying that familiar mix of resignation and resolve, the kind that whispers, "Just get through tonight," not knowing how dangerous that phrase would soon become. Because what I didn't realize then was that this house had already stopped being a refuge. It had become a place where plans were being made without me, where my future was being discussed as a problem to solve rather than a life to respect. And as I lay there listening to the sounds of a home that no longer felt like mine, I had no idea that within minutes I would hear something that would split my understanding of my own family clean in two. Something that would force me to choose between staying silent one last time or finally listening to the voice I had been muting for years. Because if I had known what was coming, if I had known what words would drift down the hallway and lodge themselves in my chest like a warning shot, I would have realized sooner that the night I thought was just another quiet surrender was actually the moment everything began to unravel, and that the smallest decision, whether to stay awake or close my eyes, would decide the rest of my life. Because 5 minutes later, as I lay there pretending to sleep, I heard footsteps slow near my door, voices drop into whispers, and my name spoken not with affection or annoyance, but with calculation, and in that instant, before a single word was fully formed, I understood something with terrifying clarity. I was no longer a guest and I was no longer safe. And if I had fallen asleep just a moment earlier, I would never have known what they were planning next. Have you ever noticed how cruelty rarely announces itself? How it doesn't kick down the door or raise its voice at first, but instead waits patiently for silence to do the work for it? Because that was the truth I was only beginning to understand as that house grew quieter in ways that felt heavier than noise. And once you've been made invisible, people stop worrying about how their actions sound. Because silence gives them permission, and I wish I could tell you that the whisper I overheard came out of nowhere. But the truth is it landed on ground that had already been carefully prepared, because long before that night, the air between us had changed, not suddenly, but gradually, like a room losing oxygen so slowly you don't realize you're suffocating until your chest aches. And it started with my son avoiding my eyes when his wife spoke over me, with him nodding along when she corrected me in front of others, smiling politely as if harmony mattered more than dignity, and I told myself he was tired. Stressed, caught in the middle, because that's what mothers do. We protect our children even when they fail to protect us. And I made excuses for his silence because acknowledging it felt too much like admitting I was alone. And the more I excused it, the more natural it became for them to speak around me instead of to me, decisions happening in half sentences and shared looks, the kind that assume you're not part of the conversation. And I began to notice how my presence changed the temperature of the room, how laughter dimmed, how conversations pivoted, how comfort only returned once I left, and that realization is a quiet kind of grief. The kind that doesn't cry but settles deep in your bones. And I wondered when my role shifted from mother to liability, from family to complication, because nobody ever tells you the exact moment your usefulness expires. They just start treating you like something that needs managing, and I adapted. Because adaptation is survival, I ate earlier so I wouldn't disrupt their evenings. I learned which questions were unwelcome and which topics closed doors. I stopped sharing memories that were met with polite impatience. And I became very good at reading the room, which is another way of saying I became good at disappearing. And if you've ever done that, made yourself smaller to keep peace, you know how exhausting it is, because silence demands constant effort, constant self-editing, and what scared me most wasn't their behavior. It was how quickly I adjusted to it, how my standards for respect lowered without me noticing, how I began measuring good days by how little I was noticed. Because silence rewards compliance, and once you comply long enough, it starts to feel like choice, and somewhere in those quiet days, I stopped expecting kindness and started hoping merely for neutrality, because neutrality felt safe, predictable. And I convinced myself that as long as no one was yelling, no one was being hurt. But silence can wound just as deeply. It just leaves fewer visible marks, and my son's silence cut the deepest. Because it told me something words never could. It told me he had chosen peace over truth, alignment over accountability. And I don't say that lightly, because I raised him to be gentle, to avoid conflict, to believe that calm was always better than confrontation. And in doing so, I may have taught him the very skill that now kept him from defending me. Because every time his wife dismissed me and he looked away, every time she spoke about me as if I were a problem to be solved and he stayed quiet, that silence confirmed something dangerous. It told her she was right, and it told me I was alone, and the house responded to that shift. It grew efficient, orderly, cold in the way places do when emotion becomes inconvenient. And I felt like a guest whose welcome had expired, not through eviction, but through neglect. And if you think that kind of environment can't turn dark, you're mistaken, because silence creates space, and space invites plans, and plans grow bolder when no one challenges them. And I began noticing small signs that made my stomach tighten: doors closing softly when I approached, phone calls taken in hushed tones, my name mentioned and then replaced with vague references, and each time I almost spoke up. Almost asked what was going on, something stopped me: the fear of confirming what I already suspected. The fear of hearing the truth out loud, because once truth is spoken, it demands action, and action felt terrifying at my age. With nowhere to go and no clear future, so I stayed quiet, telling myself I was imagining things. That stress was making me paranoid, that love doesn't vanish overnight. But silence has a way of training you not to trust your instincts. And the more I doubted myself, the freer they became, because doubt is the greatest gift you can give someone who wants control. And I didn't realize how far that control had gone until that night, when the house was wrapped in sleep and I lay awake listening to the familiar sounds of a life that no longer included me, when the quiet felt different, charged, intentional, and when I heard my son's wife whisper my name not with irritation or annoyance, but with strategy. And it struck me then that silence hadn't just been neglect, it had been preparation. A slow conditioning that made what I was about to hear feel possible, reasonable, even justified in their minds. And in that moment, as my heart began to race and my breath grew shallow, I understood something that took me years to fully accept: that screaming isn't the most dangerous form of cruelty. Silence is, because screaming gives you something to react to, but silence erases you first, making anything done to you feel easier to explain away. And as I lay there frozen, realizing that every quiet day before this one had been a step toward something much worse, I knew with terrifying clarity that whatever words were about to follow that whisper were not impulsive. They were rehearsed, considered, and rooted in a silence I had helped create by staying quiet for too long. And just before I could convince myself to dismiss it again, to tell myself I'd misheard, the whisper continued, slower now, more certain, and I realized that what I was about to hear would change everything I believed about my family, my safety, and my future. Because once silence teaches people you won't resist, they stop worrying about being overheard. And that was when she said the words that left no room for doubt. What would you do if the moment that shattered your world arrived wrapped in a whisper, so quiet it almost sounded like a thought instead of a sentence? Because that's how it happened to me, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with words released carefully into the dark, words spoken with the confidence of people who believed they were alone. And I remember how my body reacted before my mind fully caught up. How my chest tightened and my hands went cold, because some part of me understood the danger before the meaning settled in. And when she whispered, "Tomorrow will lock her away," the sentence didn't land all at once, it arrived in pieces. First the word tomorrow, heavy with certainty, then lock, sharp and final, and finally her, a pronoun that erased my name, my history, my humanity. And in that instant I realized I was no longer a person in their eyes. I was a problem with a timeline, and if you've never felt your identity stripped away in a single breath, I hope you never do, because it's a particular kind of terror, the kind that makes you question whether you're awake, whether you misheard, whether your mind is betraying you. And my first instinct was denial, not because the words weren't clear, but because accepting them felt impossible, because surely no one plans something like that about their own mother, their own family. Without hesitation, and yet the calmness in her voice told me this wasn't a thought she just had. It was a decision already made, and the most chilling part wasn't the threat itself, it was the casual way it was delivered. As if she were discussing groceries or schedules, because when people talk about you as if you're not human, they stop needing justification. And I lay there absolutely still, afraid that even my breathing might give me away. And I realized something terrifying in that moment. Something I had refused to see before: that the quiet days, the awkward silences, the polite dismissals had all been leading here. That this wasn't sudden cruelty but the natural conclusion of long-term erasure. and my mind began racing, not with anger at first, but with logistics, because fear sharpens focus, and I thought about what locker away could mean. About doors and keys and explanations that would sound reasonable to outsiders. About how easily a story can be written when the subject is already considered unreliable, already framed as confused, forgetful, difficult. And if you're older, you know how quickly those labels stick, how easily concern can be weaponized, and that's when another thought struck me, colder than the first, that they weren't worried about me resisting, they were worried about timing. About convenience, which meant they believed I was already powerless, already dependent, already manageable, and that realization hurt more than the threat itself, because it told me how they saw me. And as I lay there listening to their whispers fade into silence, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would give me away, I felt a strange shift inside me, a moment where fear and clarity collided. Because for the first time in a long while, I stopped asking myself what I could do to keep the peace and started asking what I needed to do to survive. And survival changes the questions you ask. It narrows your focus to what matters. And in that narrow focus, memories began surfacing, things I hadn't thought about in years, small decisions I'd made quietly, paperwork I'd kept, conversations I'd had long before this situation existed. And I didn't understand yet why those memories were pushing forward, only that my mind was reaching for something solid in a moment that felt unreal. And I stayed still long after the house went silent again, counting seconds, then minutes. Afraid to move, afraid to think too loudly, because once you realize people are capable of planning your disappearance from their daily lives, you understand how fragile your safety really is. And if you're wondering whether I considered confronting them right then, bursting out of the room and demanding answers, the truth is I did for a split second, but that thought died quickly, because confrontation requires leverage, and at that moment, I had none, only knowledge, and knowledge without strategy is just danger. And so I lay there replaying the sentence over and over, analyzing its tone, its certainty, the lack of hesitation. And I realized that the most important thing wasn't what they planned to do. It was what they didn't plan for, and that was me hearing it, because secrets change shape once they're exposed. They lose their power over the person who knows. And as my fear settled into something steadier, something more focused, I understood that staying meant becoming exactly what they believed me to be: compliant, manageable, quiet, but leaving on my terms. Meant reclaiming something I hadn't felt in a long time, agency, and that thought terrified me almost as much as it empowered me. Because agency comes with responsibility, with risk, with the possibility of failure. And yet it also comes with choice. And for the first time since moving into that house, I felt the faintest flicker of it return. And as dawn edged closer and the house remained unaware of what I now knew, I understood that I was standing at the edge of a decision that would define everything that came next. Because once you hear something you were never meant to hear, you can't unhear it, you can only decide what to do with it. And as I lay there staring into the dark, one thought kept repeating itself with growing urgency. If they believed tomorrow was certain, then tonight was my only window. And whatever I chose to do next would have to be done quietly, carefully, and without anyone realizing that their plan had already failed. Have you ever noticed how fear can either freeze you in place or sharpen you into something precise and deliberate? Because as I lay there listening to the quiet return to the house, I felt that shift happen inside me. The moment when panic stops being loud and becomes focused. And I understood with unsettling clarity that if I waited for morning, I would be stepping directly into whatever tomorrow meant to them, and I wasn't willing to find out. So I stayed still until I was sure the house was asleep again, counting breaths instead of minutes, because time moves differently when every sound feels like a threat. And when I finally sat up, my body felt both heavy and light. Heavy with the weight of what I'd heard, light with the urgency of decision. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something as ordinary as standing up could feel like crossing a line you can never step back over. And as my feet touched the floor, cold against my skin, I realized that this was no longer about hurt feelings or family conflict. It was about safety, and safety strips life down to its essentials. And the first essential was leaving without being noticed. because confrontation would only invite explanations, delays, and control. And I had learned enough by then to know that explanations are often just another way to keep you where you are. And I moved through that room slowly, carefully, opening drawers with practiced quiet, every creak sounding too loud in my ears. And I reached for the small bag I'd used for short trips, the one I'd kept out of habit more than intention, and my hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down, pressing them together, waiting for the tremor to pass because fear isn't weakness. It's information, and my body was telling me exactly how serious this was. And as I began packing, I was struck by how little mattered in that moment, how objects I'd once considered important lost all meaning, and how others, seemingly insignificant, suddenly felt essential. Because when you leave under fear, you don't pack for comfort, you pack for survival, and I chose clothes not for how they looked but for how they'd help me move unnoticed. I chose shoes that wouldn't draw attention, and I left behind things I'd once been afraid to part with, because attachment feels different when staying means danger. And if you've ever had to decide what parts of your life you can carry in one bag, you know how brutally honest that process is, because it forces you to confront what you actually need versus what you've been told to value. And as I packed, memories kept surfacing, moments when I'd felt dismissed, overlooked, managed, and I realized that this bag wasn't just an escape plan, it was a quiet rejection of the role they'd assigned me, and I moved with a calm I didn't know I possessed. A kind of careful efficiency that surprised me because fear can be clarifying when you let it. And I avoided the light, avoided the hallway, listening for any sound that might signal I'd been discovered, and every time I paused, I reminded myself that I was not sneaking away out of guilt. I was leaving out of necessity, and that distinction mattered more than I expected, because guilt would have slowed me down, but necessity pushed me forward. And as I reached for my bag's outer pocket, my fingers brushed against something firm and familiar, something I'd almost forgotten was there. And in that moment, my heart skipped not with fear, but with recognition. Because this wasn't just an object, it was a reminder of a decision I'd made long before this night. A decision rooted in caution, not suspicion, in preparedness, not paranoia. And as I pulled it free, the weight of it felt grounding, stabilizing like an anchor in a storm. And suddenly the panic that had been humming beneath my skin eased just enough for me to think clearly, because this wasn't just about leaving, it was about not leaving empty-handed. And that realization changed the shape of my fear, turning it into something closer to resolve. And I stood there in the dark, bag at my feet, aware that every second increased the risk of discovery, yet unable to ignore the significance of what I now held, because this wasn't something they'd considered, not because it was hidden well, but because they never thought to look, never thought I was capable of forethought. And that underestimation was the one mistake they didn't realize they'd made. And as I closed the bag slowly, listening to the soft sound of the zipper, I felt a strange mix of grief and strength. Grief for the family I thought I had, strength for the woman I was rediscovering. Because this bag represented more than an exit, it represented a boundary, a refusal to disappear quietly. And as I prepared to step into the hallway, knowing that once I did there would be no turning back, I took one last breath, steadying myself because the next steps would require more than courage. They would require timing, silence, and absolute certainty. And as I reached for the door, I realized that leaving the room was only the first part of this escape. Because what I just packed wasn't just clothes and essentials, it was leverage. And the moment they realized I was gone, they would also realize something else was missing, something they never knew I had. And that realization would come too late to stop what I was about to do next. Isn't it strange how the things that end up saving us are often the things no one ever bothered to question? Because as I stood there in the dark with my bag closed at my feet, my mind kept returning to the weight inside it. Not heavy in size, but heavy in consequence. And I realized that while they had spent months assessing my habits, my moods, my usefulness, they had never once been curious about what I kept to myself, because when people underestimate you, they assume you have nothing worth hiding, and that assumption is a dangerous one. And I hadn't kept those documents out of fear or suspicion back when I first tucked them away. I kept them out of habit. Out of a lifetime of learning that security isn't about distrust, it's about preparation, and long before I ever stepped into my son's house, I had lived a life that taught me the value of being organized, of keeping records, of understanding how quickly circumstances can change, because you don't reach my age without witnessing how suddenly stability can vanish, how health, finances, and relationships can shift overnight. And so I kept copies of things most people assume they'll never need again. Documents that told a story about who I was, what I owned, what I had a right to, and what could not be taken from me without consequence. And they weren't dramatic, they weren't secretive, they were simply thorough. The kind of paperwork that lives quietly at the bottom of a drawer until the day it becomes essential. And when I slid them into that bag earlier, I wasn't thinking about revenge or exposure, I was thinking about proof, because proof matters when voices are questioned, when memories are dismissed, when concern is used as a cover for control. And I knew instinctively that if their plan involved locking me away, then my reality would soon be described by others, not by me. And that meant I needed something solid, something objective, something that could speak even if I was prevented from doing so. And what struck me most in that moment was how confidently they had discussed my future without considering that I might have safeguards in place. Because they had already written a version of me in their minds, frail, confused, dependent, and people rarely check the pockets of someone they believe is powerless. And that realization didn't make me feel clever. It made me feel painfully aware of how invisible I had become to them. Because invisibility breeds carelessness, and carelessness leaves doors open. And as I sat there briefly, listening for any sound from the rest of the house, I reflected on the quiet irony of it all, that the same habits they'd dismissed as old-fashioned, my insistence on paperwork, my reluctance to throw things away, my preference for physical copies, were now the very things that gave me a way out. And if you're wondering why no one ever asked me about those documents, why no one ever noticed them, it's because they never imagined I'd need protection from them, and that assumption says more than any argument ever could. And as I adjusted the bag on my shoulder, feeling its weight settle comfortably, I understood that I wasn't just carrying evidence, I was carrying options, and options change everything, because fear thrives on the belief that you have none. And with each step toward the door, my fear began to shift again, becoming something steadier, more controlled, because while I didn't know exactly what the next hours would bring, I knew one thing with certainty. I was not walking out empty-handed or unprepared, and that knowledge gave me a quiet confidence I hadn't felt in years, because it reminded me that I was more than the role they'd reduced me to, more than a burden to be managed. And as I paused before leaving the room, one final thought crossed my mind, a sobering one, that if I had stayed, if I had confronted them without this leverage, I might have been painted as exactly what they needed me to be for their plan to work: unstable, emotional, unreliable. And that was the true danger I was escaping, not just the physical act of being locked away, but the narrative they were preparing to tell about me. And narratives are powerful. They shape who is believed and who is dismissed. And with those documents close, I felt ready to challenge any story they tried to write. Because facts have a way of cutting through even the most carefully constructed lies. And as I finally reached for the door handle, aware that the quiet of the house could shatter at any moment, I took a steadying breath and reminded myself that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a reckoning they hadn't anticipated. Because the moment they discovered I was gone, they would scramble to explain it, to control it, to spin it, and in doing so, they would reveal more than they realized. Because when people lose control of the person they underestimated, they make mistakes, and those mistakes would soon expose just how wrong they had been about me. And as I slipped out into the hallway, bag secure, heart steady, I knew that the documents they never asked about were about to become the reason their plan unraveled, and that by the time they understood what I was capable of, I would already be far beyond their reach, setting into motion consequences they never thought I could create. Have you ever realized that the hardest goodbyes are the ones you don't speak out loud? Because as I stood in that hallway with my bag resting against my leg, I understood that saying nothing was the most powerful choice I could make. And the house felt different in that moment, No longer just a place I was leaving, but a space I was reclaiming control from, because silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness, it's strategy. And every instinct in me wanted to leave some kind of explanation behind. A note, a word, something that would make my absence easier for them to digest. But I stopped myself because explanations invite arguments. And arguments invite delay. And delay was the one thing I couldn't afford. And I knew that if I tried to justify my leaving, they would only use those words to reshape the story in their favor. And I wasn't going to give them that. So I moved slowly, carefully, each step measured, listening for any sound that might signal I'd been discovered. And as I passed familiar doorways, memories surfaced uninvited, moments of shared laughter from years ago. Moments that made this quiet departure feel surreal, because how do you leave a place filled with memories without mourning them? And yet mourning can wait, survival cannot. And I reminded myself that leaving quietly wasn't abandonment, it was preservation. And as I reached the front door, my heart began to race again, because thresholds are dangerous places, there where plans meet reality. And I paused there longer than necessary, hand resting on the handle, thinking about how many times I'd opened that door for groceries, for appointments, for walks meant to clear my head, never imagining it would become an exit I'd have to take in secret. And I thought about my son sleeping down the hall, about the boy I raised, the man he became, and the choices he'd made through inaction. And a part of me wanted to wake him, to look him in the eyes and ask why he let it come to this, but another part of me, the part that had finally learned to listen to itself, knew that answers wouldn't change the outcome. And confrontation would only give them time, and time was no longer on my side. So I turned the handle slowly, easing the door open inch by inch, wincing at every faint sound, because when you leave under threat, even ordinary noises feel like alarms, and the night air met me like a held breath released, cool and sharp, grounding me in a way the house no longer could. And as I stepped outside, closing the door behind me just as carefully, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for what I was leaving behind, relief for what I was escaping. And for a moment I stood there, listening, half expecting someone to call my name, to demand an explanation. But the house remained silent, unaware that its control had just slipped away, and that silence, once oppressive, now felt like cover. And I walked away without looking back, not because I didn't care, but because looking back would have anchored me to a past I needed to outrun. And with every step down the driveway, I felt something lift inside me, a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Because leaving without saying goodbye was my way of refusing to play the role they'd written for me, the confused, compliant woman who needed guidance, and instead choosing to be the woman who trusted her instincts enough to act. And as I reached the street, the enormity of what I'd done finally settled in, because once you leave like that, there's no pretending it was temporary, no easing back into the old arrangement. And that finality was both terrifying and liberating, and I realized then that this wasn't just an escape, it was a declaration, one that didn't need words, because actions speak loudest to those who think they control you. And as I moved farther away, the quiet night wrapping around me, I understood that the real test wasn't getting out unnoticed. It was what would happen once they realized I was gone, because absence creates questions. And questions create panic, and panic makes people reveal their true intentions. And I knew that by morning, the calm I'd just walked out of would be replaced by confusion, then frustration, then something sharper. Because people who plan control don't react well when they lose it. And as I disappeared into the darkness, bag secure, step steady, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in years, not safety yet, but possibility. Because for the first time since moving into that house, my future was no longer being decided behind closed doors. And I knew that the silence I'd left behind would soon be filled with voices searching for me, demanding answers, and trying to regain the upper hand. And that was when the next phase of this story would truly begin. Because leaving quietly was only the first move, and the moment they realized I was gone, they would make a series of choices that would expose exactly how far they'd been willing to go, and how unprepared they were for what I had already set in motion. Have you ever noticed how silence feels completely different once you're the one choosing it? Because as I moved farther away from that house and the night slowly thinned into early morning, the quiet around me no longer felt suffocating. It felt protective, like a shield I'd finally learned how to hold. And I hadn't gone far when my phone vibrated for the first time, the sound sharp in the stillness. And I didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. Because urgency has a rhythm of its own, and my first instinct was to answer, to explain, to soothe, to make everything feel less chaotic for them, because that instinct has been trained into mothers for decades. To put out fires we didn't start, but I stopped myself, because answering would have meant stepping back into a conversation where I no longer had control, and control was the one thing I had just reclaimed, so I let it ring. And when it stopped, I expected relief, but what I felt instead was clarity, because in that pause I understood something important, that my silence now wasn't absence. It was presence, deliberate and intentional, and the phone vibrated again. Then again, each time the space between calls shrinking, and I could almost hear the shift happening on the other end. The move from confusion to concern, from concern to irritation, because when people lose access to you, they often mistake their own anxiety for love, and I knew those calls weren't about my safety yet. They were about their uncertainty, about plans interrupted, about control slipping through their fingers, and I kept walking. Each step a reminder that I didn't owe immediate answers to people who had made decisions about me without my knowledge. And as the calls continued, the messages began to follow, first gentle, almost casual, asking where I'd gone. Whether I'd gone for a walk, whether I'd forgotten my phone charger, small excuses designed to pull me back without confrontation. And I watched those messages stack up without opening them, because reading them would have reopened a door I had just closed. And I knew from experience how easily guilt could creep in through words carefully chosen to sound reasonable. And if you've ever been conditioned to prioritize harmony, you know how powerful that pull can be. And as the sky began to lighten, my phone finally went quiet for a moment. And in that silence, I realized something unsettling, that they had expected me to be where they left me, asleep, compliant, unaware, and my absence wasn't just inconvenient, it was destabilizing, because it meant their assumptions were wrong, and people don't like being proven wrong about those they believe are weaker. And when the phone rang again, the tone had changed, sharper now, more insistent, and I imagined them standing in the house, piecing things together, noticing what I'd taken, what I'd left behind. And I wondered when the realization would hit them that this wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a decision. And I knew that once that understanding settled in, the narrative would shift, because when concern doesn't work, control tries a different language, and I braced myself for what would come next, because I've lived long enough to recognize patterns, and the next messages did exactly what I expected. They moved from questions to accusations. From "Are you okay?" to "Why would you do this to us?" Subtle at first, then more direct, and that shift told me everything I needed to know, because genuine concern doesn't turn into blame so quickly, and I felt a flicker of anger then. Not the explosive kind, but the steady kind that fuels resolve, because those messages confirmed what I'd feared, that my well-being was secondary to their convenience. And still, I didn't respond. Because silence was no longer something being imposed on me. It was something I was using, and every unanswered call forced them to sit with the uncertainty they'd planned for me. And as the morning fully arrived and the world around me began to wake, I realized that by not answering, I was doing more than protecting myself. I was gathering information. Because how people react when they lose control tells you who they really are, and each missed call, each escalating message, painted a clearer picture of their priorities. And I knew that responding too soon would interrupt that revelation, would give them a chance to adjust their story, to soften their approach, and I wanted to see what came next. Because whatever they chose to do in my absence would reveal the depth of what they'd been willing to plan. And as the phone buzzed again, this time with a message that crossed from concern into something colder, something that hinted at consequences, I felt a strange calm settle over me, because fear thrives on immediacy, and I had removed that from the equation, and in that calm, I understood that my silence was forcing them to confront a reality they hadn't prepared for. A reality where I was not where they left me, not doing what they expected, and not responding the way they'd assumed I would. And that realization would push them to act, to reach out beyond me, to explain my absence to others. And that was the moment I was waiting for, because once they started explaining, once they started justifying, they would expose themselves. And I knew that whatever story they told would soon collide with facts they didn't realize I carried. And as I let the phone vibrate one more time without answering, I understood that this phase wasn't about escape anymore. It was about observation, about watching the cracks form as their control slipped away, because the calls I didn't answer were already forcing them into choices. And those choices would determine what happened next and who would be believed when the truth finally surfaced. Have you ever wondered how someone can endure something for years and still struggle to explain why they didn't speak up sooner? Because as I sat there listening to my phone finally fall silent, that question turned inward, sharp and unavoidable. And I knew that if this story were ever told, there would be people who asked why I stayed, why I tolerated the dismissals, the quiet erasure, the growing sense of unease, and the answer isn't simple or flattering. Because staying quiet isn't about weakness, it's about conditioning, about years of being taught that peace is more valuable than truth, that endurance is a virtue, and that causing discomfort, even in the face of injustice, is something to be ashamed of. And for women of my generation, especially mothers and grandmothers, silence was often framed as love, as sacrifice, as maturity, and we learned early on that being easy made life smoother for everyone else. And so we practiced it until it became instinct. And when I moved into my son's house, I carried that instinct with me, believing that my role was to adapt, to be grateful, to not complicate things, and every time something felt wrong, I told myself it was temporary, that I could manage it, that speaking up would only create tension. And tension felt like failure, because somewhere along the way, I learned to measure my worth by how little space I took up. And that belief is powerful because it convinces you that discomfort is the price of belonging. And as time passed, silence stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like habit. And habits are hard to break, especially when they're reinforced by subtle rewards, a calm evening, a polite nod, the absence of open conflict. And I told myself that as long as no one was shouting, no one was being hurt, but I was wrong. Because harm doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly and settles in, reshaping your expectations until you can no longer tell what's reasonable. And the longer I stayed quiet, the more the imbalance grew. Because silence doesn't just protect the peace, it protects the status quo, and the status quo wasn't built for me, it was built for convenience. And I also stayed quiet because of fear, fear of being alone, fear of being judged. Fear of confirming the stereotype that older women are difficult or dramatic. And fear has a way of making bad situations feel safer than uncertain ones. And if you've ever hesitated to speak up because you didn't know what would happen next, you understand that calculation, the quiet weighing of known discomfort against unknown risk, and I chose the known for a long time. Because at least it felt predictable, and there was also love tangled up in my silence. Love for my son, complicated and enduring, and love can make us blind. It can convince us that protecting someone from discomfort is the same as protecting them from consequences. And I told myself that if I just endured, if I didn't force him to choose, things might improve on their own. And that hope kept me quiet longer than I care to admit, because hope is comforting even when it's unrealistic, and I see now how that silence taught them something. It taught them that I wouldn't resist, that I would absorb whatever discomfort was handed to me, that I could be managed without complaint. And that lesson emboldened them because people test boundaries quietly before they cross them loudly. And by the time I realized how far the boundary had moved, I was already standing in a place I never intended to be. And as I reflected on all of this, sitting there with my phone finally still, I felt a mix of shame and compassion toward myself. Shame for the moments I ignored my instincts, compassion for the woman who did what she believed was necessary to survive, and that compassion mattered. Because blaming myself would have pulled me back into the same pattern, silence fueled by guilt, and I refused to let that happen again. And as the morning wore on, I understood that my silence had not been meaningless. It had taught me how to observe, how to read between the lines, how to recognize when concern turns into control, and those skills were now serving me in a different way. Because the same awareness that once kept me quiet was now helping me stay alert. And I realized that speaking up doesn't always mean speaking loudly. Sometimes it means choosing when and how to break your silence. And I had finally chosen, and that choice didn't erase the years I stayed quiet, but it reframed them, turning them into preparation rather than failure. And as I gathered my thoughts, aware that the next steps would require clarity and courage, I made myself a promise not just to act, but to understand why I'd stayed silent so I wouldn't repeat it. Because the danger wasn't just what they'd planned to do to me. It was how easily I'd been conditioned to accept less than I deserved, and that realization was painful. But it was also empowering, because once you understand the roots of your silence, you can finally choose your voice. And I knew that the next phase of this story would require that voice, not in anger, not in panic, but in truth, because silence had already done enough damage. And whatever came next would demand that I step fully into the space I had spent so long trying not to occupy. And as I looked ahead, I understood that breaking my silence wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about changing the story they thought they could tell about me, and that reckoning was closer than they realized. Have you ever felt the exact second when fear loosens its grip and something heavier, steadier, takes its place? Because that's what happened as the morning settled and the world moved on as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. While I sat there fully aware that everything had changed, and it wasn't because the danger had disappeared, it was because I could finally see the shape of it, and once you can name a threat, you can plan around it. And planning is where power quietly returns, and I knew that the moment they realized I wasn't coming back, the story they'd been preparing would begin to collapse under its own weight, because plans built on secrecy don't survive daylight. And it didn't take long for that realization to reach them, because my phone, silent for a while, suddenly erupted again, not with questions this time, but with urgency, the kind that comes when people sense control slipping through their hands. And I didn't answer, because answering would have let them steer the conversation, and I wasn't ready to hand that back. And instead I watched, calmly now, as the pattern shifted again, the messages growing more frantic, less polished, revealing cracks in the calm confidence I'd overheard the night before. And that contrast told me something important, that whatever certainty they'd felt then was already eroding, and certainty doesn't erode unless something has gone wrong. And I realized that me being gone was only part of the problem. The bigger issue was that they no longer knew what I knew. And uncertainty is deeply unsettling to people who rely on control. And I imagined them standing in the house, retracing steps, checking rooms, piecing together what I might have heard, what I might have taken. And I knew that every unanswered call was forcing them to confront the possibility that their plan wasn't as private as they thought. And that possibility changes behavior. It makes people defensive, reactive, careless, and carelessness creates openings. And that's when the tables truly began to turn, not in a dramatic confrontation, but in the quiet realization that I was no longer reacting to them, they were reacting to me. And that shift, once it happens, is impossible to reverse, because power doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in who is waiting for whom to speak first. And for the first time in a long while, they were waiting on me, and I felt a strange calm in that knowledge, not satisfaction, not revenge, but balance. Because balance returns when neither side can move without considering the other. And as the morning wore on, the messages began to include other names, references to outside help, to advice being sought. And that told me they were no longer confident in handling this alone. And confidence is the first thing control relies on. And without it, people start reaching for allies, explanations, and justifications. And each of those creates witnesses, and witnesses complicate secrets. And I understood then that my next move didn't need to be immediate or loud. It needed to be precise, because timing matters when the truth is involved. And revealing too much too soon can be just as dangerous as revealing nothing at all. And I thought about the documents in my bag, about the options they gave me, about how easily concern could be turned into a narrative if I wasn't careful. And I decided that silence, for now, was still my strongest position, because silence was forcing them to act without knowing where I stood. And that uncertainty would expose their priorities. And as expected, their tone shifted again from frantic to calculated, messages carefully worded, almost rehearsed, as if they were already preparing for someone else to read them. And that told me more than any confession could, because people only curate their words when they anticipate scrutiny. And I felt a chill at that realization, because it confirmed how quickly the situation was escalating behind the scenes. And yet, despite that escalation, I felt more grounded than I had in months, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to manage their reactions. I was allowing them to reveal themselves, and that was the moment I truly understood how much power I'd been giving away by staying quiet before. Because silence, when unchosen, is oppression, but silence, when chosen deliberately, is observation, and observation leads to clarity, and clarity leads to leverage. And as the day progressed and the world around me continued on in its ordinary rhythms, I felt the distance between us grow, not just physically, but psychologically, because they no longer had access to my immediate responses, my explanations, my guilt, and without those, they were forced to face the situation as it was, not as they'd planned it to be. And I knew that the next step would come from them, not me, because people who lose control always make the next move, and that move, whatever it was, would tell me exactly how far they were willing to go, and exactly how necessary it had been for me to leave when I did. Because the true turning point wasn't my escape. It was the moment they realized I was no longer playing the role they'd assigned me. And that realization would shape everything that happened next. Because once the tables turn, the only question left is how each side responds. And their response was about to reveal the truth they'd worked so hard to hide. Have you ever waited years for someone to truly see you, only to realize that when it finally happens, it hurts more than being ignored? Because that was the feeling that washed over me when my son finally reached out in a way that felt different from the others. Not rushed, not demanding, but heavy with something that sounded like uncertainty. And that uncertainty told me the ground beneath him had shifted. And when I saw his name on the screen, I didn't answer immediately, not out of spite, but because I needed to understand what had changed. Because sometimes the most important part of a conversation is the pause before it begins. And when I finally did respond, I kept it brief, measured, refusing to offer explanations or comfort. Because I had spent too many years providing both at the expense of myself, and what followed wasn't an argument or an apology at first. It was confusion, real and disorienting, and in that confusion, I heard something I hadn't heard in a long time: hesitation. Because hesitation means someone is questioning their assumptions. And that questioning opened a door I didn't rush to walk through, because clarity takes time. And as the exchange continued, he began to ask questions, not the kind designed to regain control, but the kind that come from realizing you might not know the whole story, and those questions cut deep. Because they forced me to confront a painful truth, that my silence had allowed him to believe a version of events that kept him comfortable. And comfort is a powerful motivator. And I answered him carefully, not with accusations, not with emotion, but with facts, because facts are harder to dismiss. And as I laid them out one by one, I could feel the shift happening on the other end, the slow, uncomfortable realization that the situation was not as he'd been led to believe. And that realization hurt us both, because it meant acknowledging not just his wife's role, but his own, and I didn't shield him from that. Not anymore, because shielding had gotten us here. And when he finally asked me why I hadn't said anything sooner, his voice tight with regret, I told him the truth, that I had been afraid of losing him, afraid of becoming a problem, afraid of confirming the narrative that I was difficult. And saying those words out loud felt like releasing a weight I'd been carrying for years, because naming fear takes away some of its power, and there was a long silence after that. A different kind of silence than the ones before, not dismissive, not strategic, but heavy with realization. And in that silence, I knew he was finally seeing me not as a role or a responsibility, but as a person who had been hurting quietly, and that moment mattered not because it fixed everything, but because it shifted the foundation. And I told him something else then, something I hadn't planned to say but needed to. That love without respect isn't love, it's obligation, and I had fulfilled my obligations for years. But I was done sacrificing my dignity to keep the peace, and he didn't argue with that, he couldn't. Because once you recognize a truth, arguing against it only deepens the wound, and instead he listened, really listened. And that listening felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable because it was something I'd wanted for so long, and yet. Even in that moment, I was careful not to confuse acknowledgement with accountability, because seeing the problem is not the same as fixing it. And I knew that whatever came next would require more than words, it would require choices. And as the conversation drew to a close, I could hear the conflict in his voice, the pull between what he was beginning to understand and what he had been protecting. And that conflict told me the story was far from over. Because awareness is only the first step, and people often struggle with what to do once they reach it. And as I ended the call, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time, I understood that this wasn't a reunion or a resolution. It was a reckoning, and reckoning is uncomfortable by design, because it forces you to decide who you are willing to disappoint. And I knew that my son was standing at that crossroads now, forced to choose between maintaining the version of reality that kept his life intact and confronting the truth that threatened to dismantle it. And I also knew that his choice would determine not just our relationship, but how the rest of this situation unfolded, because once he truly looked at me, he could no longer claim ignorance. And that meant the next steps would be measured not by intentions, but by actions, and those actions were about to reveal just how deep this betrayal really ran. Have you ever reached a moment where you realize you could hurt someone back, but doing so would only tether you to the very pain you're trying to escape? Because that was the crossroads I found myself standing at after everything finally came into the open, when the truth was no longer hidden in whispers or unanswered calls, but sitting plainly between us, heavy and undeniable. And I would be lying if I said revenge didn't cross my mind, because it did, quietly at first, then with more clarity, as I recognized how much power I now held, how easily I could expose what had been planned, how justified anger could be sharpened into consequence. And yet, alongside that temptation, there was another realization growing, one that surprised me with its strength: that revenge would keep me tied to their story, while peace would allow me to finally write my own. And that distinction mattered more than I expected, because I had already spent too many years reacting to other people's decisions, adjusting myself around their comfort. And I wasn't about to let my freedom be shaped by retaliation. And this wasn't about forgiveness in the way people often imagine it, soft and immediate, offered for the comfort of others. It was about self-respect, about deciding that my energy, my remaining years, were worth more than prolonged conflict. And as I considered my options, I thought about what revenge would actually look like: the endless explanations, the reliving of pain, the public scrutiny, the way it would require me to stay engaged with people who had already taken too much from me. And I realized that while I was prepared to protect myself, I didn't want to live in reaction mode anymore. Because reaction keeps you anchored to the moment that hurt you, and I wanted distance, not just physical, but emotional. And choosing peace didn't mean ignoring what had happened or pretending it hadn't mattered. It meant setting boundaries so clear they didn't require constant defense. And boundaries are a form of power that doesn't need to announce itself, because they work quietly, consistently, and without drama. And I communicated those boundaries carefully, not with anger, not with ultimatums, but with clarity, stating what I would and would not accept moving forward, and how contact would look if it were to continue at all. And that clarity unsettled them more than any outburst could have, because calm boundaries leave no room for negotiation. And I could hear the frustration beneath their responses, the desire to argue, to justify, to minimize. And I refused to engage in that cycle, because cycles are what keep unhealthy dynamics alive, and breaking one requires stepping out of rhythm. And I also made peace with something difficult: that choosing peace might mean choosing distance. And distance from your own child is not a decision any mother makes lightly. But I understood then that closeness without respect is just another form of loss, and I wasn't willing to lose myself again. And as days passed, the urgency faded, replaced by a quiet adjustment to a new reality, one where my days were no longer shaped by tension or vigilance. And in that quiet, I noticed how much lighter I felt, how my thoughts were no longer consumed by anticipation of conflict. And that lightness confirmed I'd made the right choice, because peace, real peace, doesn't feel dramatic, it feels steady. And I also reflected on how easily people assume that strength must look like punishment, when sometimes it looks like restraint. Like walking away from the chance to wound because you no longer need validation from someone else's pain. And that realization changed how I saw myself, because for so long I had equated endurance with virtue. But now I saw that choosing peace was an active decision, one that required courage, self-trust, and a willingness to disappoint others to protect yourself. And I didn't pretend that everything was resolved, because resolution is a process, not a moment, and there were still consequences to be addressed, still truths that couldn't be ignored. But I approached those matters from a place of calm authority rather than fear or anger. And that shift altered every interaction, because people respond differently when they realize you're no longer seeking their approval. And as I settled into this new phase, I understood that peace wasn't something I was waiting to receive. It was something I was choosing to maintain. Day by day, boundary by boundary, and that choice was the greatest act of self-respect I'd ever made, because it signaled that my worth was no longer negotiable. And as I looked ahead, aware that one final step remained in this journey, I felt a quiet certainty take root, that my story was no longer defined by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to do next, and that the final chapter wouldn't be about confrontation or control, but about reclaiming my voice fully, not just for myself, but for every grandmother who had ever been told, directly or indirectly, to stay quiet. And that was the story I was finally ready to tell. Have you ever wondered how many women are quietly disappearing in plain sight, not because they lack strength, but because they were taught to hide it? Because as I sit with the calm that followed everything I've shared, I realize this story was never meant to end with me alone. It was meant to reach you, the ones who learned early that love meant endurance, that respect was something you earned by being agreeable, and that silence was the price of belonging. And if you're listening to this with a knot in your chest or a quiet recognition you can't quite name, I want you to know that you're not imagining it, and you're not weak for feeling it, because what you've been carrying is heavy. And it was never meant to be carried alone. And I stayed silent for a long time because I believed my voice mattered less than everyone else's comfort. And that belief nearly cost me everything. And if there is one truth I've learned, it's that silence does not protect you. It only delays the moment when you must choose yourself. And choosing yourself doesn't make you selfish, it makes you honest. And honesty is what sets boundaries where silence once stood. And I know how hard that choice feels, because it asks you to risk being misunderstood, to risk disappointing people you love, to risk stepping into uncertainty when familiarity, even painful familiarity, feels safer. But I also know what happens when you don't make that choice. You slowly fade from your own life, becoming a supporting character in stories written by others. And you deserve more than that. You deserve to be seen, heard, and respected. Not because of what you provide, but because of who you are. And if you are living in a situation that makes you feel small, invisible, or afraid to speak, please listen to that feeling, because it is not a flaw, it is information. And information gives you options, even when it doesn't feel like it at first. And speaking up doesn't always mean confrontation. Sometimes it means preparation. Sometimes it means leaving quietly. Sometimes it means setting boundaries that don't require explanation. And sometimes it means asking for help without apologizing for needing it. And whatever form it takes for you, know this: your voice is valid at any age. Your instincts are not expired, and your life does not lose value because others have grown comfortable taking it for granted. And I share this not to frighten you, but to remind you of something you may have forgotten. That strength doesn't disappear with time, it evolves, and the wisdom you carry is not a burden. It is protection. And if my story resonates with you, let it be a mirror, not a warning. A reminder that it is never too late to choose safety, dignity, and peace. And to those who have been told to stay quiet, to not cause trouble, to be grateful for scraps of respect, I want you to hear this clearly: you are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to leave situations that harm you, and you are allowed to protect yourself without explaining why. And if you're wondering where to begin, begin by trusting yourself, because that trust is the foundation everything else stands on. And as this story comes to a close, I hope it does more than hold your attention. I hope it reaches into that quiet place where doubt lives and replaces it with something steadier, something braver. Because silence may have shaped parts of our past, but it does not have to define our future. And if you take nothing else from my journey, take this: your voice matters, your safety matters, and you do not owe anyone your silence ever again.